Hello, bookworms. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where we talk about your favorite books. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and my guest today is Debra Dean. Debra is the best-selling author of 4 critically acclaimed books that have been published in 21 languages. Her debut novel, The Madonnas of Leningrad, was a New York Times Editor's Choice, a #1 Book Sense pick, a Booklist Top 10 novel, and an American Library Association Notable Book of the Year. Her newest book, Hidden Tapestry, tells the true story of Belgian-American artist Jan Joers. Y'all, I just started this one, and it's one of those the truth is stranger and even more riveting than fiction type of books. Debra's a native of Seattle, and she and her husband live in Miami, where she's on the creative writing faculty at Florida International University. I love talking to teachers about the books they love to teach. I think they have a really special insight, not only into why they themselves love a book, but also into what others think upon reading it. I'm really excited that Debra joined me today to talk about why The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro is the best book ever. Hi, Debra Dean. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. Here's my first question for you.
Okay.
When we initially talked about you appearing here, you were debating between 4 books that you wanted to talk about. And ultimately, you decided on this one, Remains of the Day. And your reasoning was that it was the one you most wanted to reread of the 4 before we talked. So my first question for you is about rereading. Can you tell me what that process is that made you decide that's the one? What caused you to want to reread this one?
To be honest, I think I'm looking for comfort books these days. So I don't usually do this. I don't usually reread books, honestly. I'm a very slow reader. And so I have to I teach literature. And so I reread things when I'm teaching them, but I tend not to go back and reread books just for pleasure because I'm such a slow reader. There's always some new book that I have that everybody else has already read that I want to, get to. This one, I just love this book. And there are things about it that I know when I go back, I'm going to enjoy again. And it's not a simple book, but it's an easy book. The pleasures of it are easy. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, in the midst of all of this insanity, I wanted something that was kind of comforting. This is like sort of like the literary. This will scratch the Downton Abbey itch if you have to have one.
I have to tell you something I noticed, and you can tell me if I'm off base here, but of the 4 that you were talking about, I've read 3 of them. And my immediate thought about the 3 that I've read is they are all 3 slow paced and very, very thoughtful and very subtle. And they're all, I thought, the 3, about the fragility of being human. Mm-hmm. And they're not giant plot-driven books, any of them. And so I'm wondering, is that kind of a through line for all of your recreational reading, or are those just your favorites have that quality?
That's pretty much that's my go-to. I tend to prefer character-driven rather than plot-driven. I was raised on, English Victorian fiction that is slow. I have a tolerance for slowness that most people maybe don't have. I see with my students now that they don't have it. But yeah, I like the slow unfolding of stories. And it kind of reminds me of my life when I could spend a whole day just reading. And, I like that.
Mm-hmm. So how did you eventually chose The Remains of the Day. How were you introduced to this book?
I think I read it when it came out, and which was what, in the 80s? Is that right?
1988.
Yes. And I don't remember necessarily how I find books. People tell me about them. So I don't remember, but I do remember it was pretty new when I got
Mm-hmm.
it. And I then went on and read the two previous books. This was his third book. And then I went and read the two previous novels that he had written, which were surprising to me because this is a book that is, I said, it's like, Downton Abbey-ish. It's about an English butler between the wars. And the other two books are set in Japan. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, whoa, it was a surprise to me. And then I've subsequently gone on and read a few other things of his, but I just loved this book. And at the time I was teaching literature. I mostly just teach creative writing now, but I was teaching more broadly than I was teaching literature. And I started teaching it. And it's a great book for, to introduce students to the idea of subtext and, the unreliable narrator. And they liked reading it. And in fact, I had one student. I'd been teaching this for years, and I don't always expect students to come after I've been teaching it for a long time. I sort of know what they're going to ask and what they're going to say. But I had this one student who was Japanese, and he read this book, and he came to me during my office hours, and he said, Professor Dean, this is me. I'm Stephen, And I thought, what? And he started telling me that he related so intensely to this narrator. And it described his relationship with his father. And I like I say, I was completely caught off guard. And then I started thinking about it, and it opened up a whole new understanding of the novel for me, because, I was just thinking about it being British. Uh-huh. But in fact, Ishiguro was born in Japan, and his family moved to England when he was like 5 years old. So he didn't grow up there, but he was raised by Japanese parents, teaching him Japanese culture and speaking Japanese. And in some ways, the kind of the reticence that of and the extreme politeness of Japanese culture, and the relationship between parent and child that is formal, I thought, oh, this is, and I don't know how much of that is kind of a colonial influence, although, Japan wasn't strictly speaking colonial. They modeled themselves after English culture. But I think it is really just more that kind of overlap between English and Japanese culture that I just hadn't picked up on. And so, it was like, it blew my mind when I first heard that from him.
Yeah, that is fascinating, because I thought I have always felt like it is the most British book. So what an interesting comment.
Yeah, right. And and like I say, it made sense once I stopped to think about it, because my friends that I know that are Japanese, and not Japanese American, but Japanese, they do have a different kind of filial relationship with their parents. And that's described in this book. Stevens models his life to be like his father. And the two of them are so uncommunicative and rigid that they don't know how to talk to each other. And to me, that's one of the most heartbreaking moments in the book is when Stephen Sr. is on his deathbed and asks his son if he was a good father, and Stevens doesn't even know how to talk about it. He's trying to say, you were a good son. Was I a good father? I expect not. And he can't wait to get out of the room, and just doesn't know how to speak.
Will you give a brief outline of the plot for our listeners who maybe haven't read this book or seen the movie.
Yes. Which actually, is a good movie. I don't usually recommend movies of books, and I would still say read the book first.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've read the book, it's delightful to watch the movie. It's not a disappointment at all. It's a novel about the perfect English butler who, at the end of his career, is reflecting back on his life and on his service. And he takes it, the book covers, I think, 4 days or 5 days. He takes a little driving holiday, supposedly with just to go up and see a housekeeper that used to be employed at Darlington Hall, where he has served his whole career, to see if maybe she would like to come back and work. And so we are taken in the present moment on this journey up through the English countryside. And he's using the time to reflect back on his years of service at Darlington Hall and what has happened, what happened with that housekeeper. But as I said, he's an unreliable narrator. He does not know his own story. And so we are finding out the real story of his life, between the lines. And then it's starting to, as he reviews it, the truth of it very slowly comes to him as well. Until at the end of the book, he reunites with this housekeeper that, they had this incredibly repressed love affair. You would never know it from his telling, but they were, there was this little aborted romance. Ishiguro is masterful. And so it starts to come on you slowly. I mean, you're right with him for a long time. And then it starts to come on you slowly, like, there are things he protests too much, methinks. There are times when he's when he's insisting that you, the reader, will be as interested in him in what the Hayes Society says are the qualities of a great butler. He's clearly not aware of his audience, and so that's the way that Ishiguro starts introducing this unreliability. He doesn't know who he's talking to. And then there's just things that sort of unawareness of his own story that starts to creep in. And usually with unreliable narrators, you want the reader to know at the beginning that the narrator is unreliable. But this is a harder thing to pull off, but I like it.
Do you feel like he knew what the Lord Darlington was up to and just did not want to besmirch his employer? Or there were times, this is the masterful writing as well, because there were times I thought Stevens is the most profoundly unaware man who has ever lived.
Yeah.
But then other times I thought, oh, he knows damn straight what's going on, and he wants to just keep his job.
No, I think it's the first one. I think he was very unaware. And I think, well, you know what? I should say it's like maybe halfway between the two. Because I think he was profoundly unaware because he was so invested in the mythology and the whole purpose of his life as he sees it depends on this mythology that he's constructed. And, when people have that much invested in a belief system, they can ignore, as we are seeing, they can ignore an awful lot of obvious cues, and find reasons to excuse things and to overlook things. So he was having to work kind of hard at that. It turns out that Darlington is not the Lord Darlington, that the man that he served is not the admirable character that he has made him out to be. And he has invested his sense of his own worth in working for this house and advancing the goals of his employer. So, his whole self-identity rests on that. And of course, I'm comparing everything to our current political situation these days. And I see people doing that now, that in ways that mystify me, like, how can you not, how can you, how can you keep believing these things? And how can you not see this? How can you excuse this? And it just seems like people's capacity to perform these kinds of pretzel logic, it's been an education. So yeah, Stephen, I believe that he is very unconscious, and that the progress of the novel is his awakening.
It was a different experience reading it this year. And also what I thought was fascinating about it was his notion of service and how we Americans are not acclimated to that. And I'm sure in England as well, they're not as acclimated anymore as they used to be in this caste system of where butlers stand, and some butlers are in higher regard if they're in grander houses and that kind of thing. And I was really fascinated by the complete dedication to that caste system that he had, even as it was crumbling around him, and his solid belief in his servitude.
Yeah.
And we don't have that.
No. And I think in a way, I mean, if you extend the idea of service, I think in some ways it's a loss that, American culture doesn't respect service. And I think as human beings, we should respect people who perform service for us. I mean, right now in the pandemic, there's this thing, it's like, the essential workers, we're suddenly noticing all of these people that how deeply we rely on them. I'm not sure that that's adequately rewarded, but I think our culture would benefit by shifting our idea of rethinking service as something that is admirable and noble. And this goes back again to this idea. I mean, I think that's a Japanese idea too. That that you do service well, you dedicate your life to something, and that's noble.
When you teach this book, how do students respond to this? Is this interesting to a young person?
My students, when I assigned it, they really liked it. They really liked part of what they liked was that the book, when they learn how to read metaphor and symbolism, that's fun, it's like a key opening up. And so this book, it's a journey book. And so there's the literal journey and there's the spiritual journey that he's on simultaneously. And, Ishiguro has this way of talking about the landscape and using the landscape as a metaphor for Stephen's understanding or lack of it. And so there's constantly places, and it's easy for you to see once you're keyed into it. It's just all over the place, where he's talking about he couldn't see around this corner, and he's talking about it at the same time that we know that these events in the past that he's talking about are also places where he could not see around the corner. So for a student that's learning to do that, that's fun.
What do you think is the purpose of the scene in the bar where he sort of plays up his role at Darlington Hall and kind of casually says, "I've met Churchill," and doesn't say, I served him a glass of port?
Well, I mean, I think he's proud of what he has done, and he's a snob, and he aligns himself with the ruling class. And so I think he enjoys that being important, and being treated like somebody who is important as opposed to being dismissed as a butler. And I also think sometimes, I don't know, maybe you don't do this. There have been times in my life where I've traveled and I'm sitting on a plane and I'll play a role, I was an actress in my first life, and I'm actually pretty good with accents. And so, I'll just be on a plane with the person in the seat next to me. I'll just, I'll invent a whole persona. It's, if it's a long flight, it's fun. I think I don't know that there's a deep thematic purpose for it, except that, he also did later on, he denies having known Lord Darlington. He has his Peter moment where, denying Christ kind of. So I think he's out of the house for the first time, and he's not the butler. And so, that kind of disorienting thing of I could be someone else.
I thought that scene was profoundly sad this time around.
Yeah. There's it's an interesting book because on the one hand, there's so much humor in the book, but it's also heartbreaking. And, it does both of those things sometimes from one page to the next. I have come to a different attitude about reading than I used to have. I used to have a sense of obligation and kind of this Girl Scout, you start something, you finish it. Doesn't matter, you have to get to the end of this book. And I don't believe that anymore. Life is too short. And I have found I had a really hard time reading at the beginning of the pandemic. I just I was, and I don't know whether I was just picking up the wrong books, but I don't think that explains it all. And I just thought, you know what? I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to, just keep slogging through. There was one book, which of course I will not name, but I was slogging. And part of the reason was a friend had lent it to me. It's kind of at this point where we were loaning each other books because we couldn't go to the library or we couldn't go buy books. And so she passed this book along to me, and she didn't say anything about it. I think she thought I might be interested in it because it sort of aligns with what I'm writing now. And so I kept going and it was soporific. I mean, I would start reading and I would fall asleep. So it was like 2 pages at a time. And I got halfway through it and I just went, I'm never going to finish this. I'm just going to have to tell her. Couldn't get through it. So, I told her and she said, oh yeah, me neither.
Oh, so she was just pushing it off on you.
But I don't know. Do you know who Nancy Pearl is? The librarian? No. Okay. So she used to be on NPR and she used to write, you got to look her up. She talks about books, and she has books on, here's the books to read. Like she has a series of these. And she was like the rock star of librarians. And she had Nancy Pearl's rule of 100, which is that you take your age and you subtract your age from 100. And whatever is left over is the number of pages you have to read before you can throw the book against the wall. So, if you're young, you have to read more because you don't know yet. And by the time you get to 100, you can judge a book by its cover if you want.
That's right.
And I apply that rule.
Yeah, I do know that rule. So I must have come across her somewhere. But I have to tell you that because I'm a firm believer in that rule, because I will not waste my time on books I don't like. I just have too many unread books. But something happened that disturbed my belief in that rule a couple of years ago. And that is that 2 unrelated people in 1 week both said to me, I just read Grapes of Wrath. Have you ever read that one? And I went, I don't think I've ever read that one. And both of them. And they were both men I really, really trust. They're both book advisors to me. And then when the second one said, I just read Grapes of Wrath, and I went, what the hell? I got to read this book. I've read a lot of Steinbeck, but I had never read that one. And so I picked it up, and oh my God, it was the most boring thing I've ever read in my life. And I kept sort of hate texting both of them, like, this is dumb. I don't like this book. It's boring. And they both kind of said, well, it's your life, Toots.
Really?
Yeah. But they also both said it bears sticking with. And I did. And I was so glad I stuck with it, because once I got into the story, and I'm pretty sure it's something like 9,000 pages long or something. I'm maybe exaggerating, but I don't know. But I was glad at the end that I had read it and stuck with it. Not just so I could say I had read a classic, but because I got something from the story. But it does make me wonder, how many really great stories have I pitched because I got to that? I did that 100 minus my age rule and just got impatient. And I don't know. I've probably missed a lot of really good books because they didn't grab me on day one.
We're all going to miss. We live in, we're living in an age. We're not Milton where, if we're well read, we can read everything that was ever written. It's not possible. He did that. He was, there were just not that many books at the time. It was possible to read everything that had been ever written. It's not, it hasn't been possible for a long time. And as I said, I'm a very slow reader, and that makes me much more selective about, I'm not just going to pick up something. I don't read something that's like, I don't do trash reading, and it's not a snobby thing. It's just like, my life's too short. I gotta try and read wonderful books, deep, wonderful books.
Okay. So then my next question is, what do you read if you are exhausted? Because when I am exhausted is when I go for a quote unquote trash read, a quick read, a comedy, a rom-com. That is all I want on those days. So when you're in that mood where you're exhausted by the news cycle and can't think too hard, what are you going to read?
Kate Atkinson.
Oh, I love Kate Atkinson.
I do too. And God bless her. She's prolific,
Yeah.
You can say, I want to read a Kate Atkinson, and there's another one there. Yeah. I love her. And she's just, she's so good with story that the story just carries you along. You don't have to work at it. But there's meat on those bones too.
So tell me, what are you reading right now?
Right now, I am reading my student writing. I'm reading things to do with research for my own writing. And as I said, I've been tossing a lot of books. So, I was thinking, I knew you were going to ask this question. I thought, well, there's no point in telling people what books I've tossed. Yeah. So, I'll tell you what I had, what I've read recently that I think would be worth picking up. How's that? Is that a good way to spin the question? And one of the ones that I thought, I want to talk about this is Severance by Ling Ma. Her novel is about the last survivors of a world pandemic. So this is not escape literature because it's freakily. She wrote it it was published in 2018. And
holy moly,
yeah. And in fact, the weird thing is, she was our guest. I teach at Florida International University, and we have a writer series where we bring in writers to talk about their books. And she came in last February with this book. And so she was our last real live guest before the pandemic shut us down.
And that was literally 1 month before everything. Oh my God.
And of course, all of a sudden, we had booked her a year in advance, but all of a sudden it was like she was on NPR all the time because people were starting to talk about this virus. And she wrote a novel about a virus and about a pandemic. And I mean, the twist in her book is that the sufferers of you get this virus and you turn into a zombie. So yeah, it's not like it's exactly what we're experiencing now, but it's a good read. I've noticed people have gone two ways. Mm-hmm. They're either really digging in to all of the uncomfortable moments that we're going through, whether it's about the pandemic or whether it's Black Lives Matter, or, there's people that are really reading in that direction. And then there's people that are backpedaling the other way and like, get me as far away from the present moment. What else am I reading fiction for except to escape,
Yeah. Right.
So there's one, if you're that, okay. if you're the reader that goes in that direction. And the other one that I thought, that I read is not fiction. It's The Art of the Wasted Day by Patricia Hampel. And she's a memoirist. And it's just, and I love her writing anyway, but this one is, it's a meditation on leisure. And, in the original sense of having the time and the means to get lost in thought, to let whole days go by just observing or thinking or reading. And she begins with her own childhood. And I think most people reading the book, if you're going to go read Patricia Hampl, you're going to relate to this, that wonderful thing of just being able to spend a whole day lying under a tree and just looking,
Mm-hmm.
And so she starts with her own childhood, but then she expands her inquiry into to look at historical figures, and the idea of leisure, the historical idea of leisure. And so she looks at, like Montaigne and Mendel and Nabokov and people that, had lives that afforded them that, Virginia Woolf. And what we miss by not using our leisure in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think, we have leisure time, but we just fill it with, distraction. And it's also, she's also writing, because she's a memoirist. I mean, she's also writing about the practice of memoir, because that is the practice of observing the world. And so it's very wise. It's a very wise book, and it's gentle.
What are you reading in poetry?
I just finished reading a book called Moonjar, and it's a first book of poetry she had a chapbook before this, but this is her first full book, by Dee Dee Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, this is gonna, it's about her, it's linked poems, it's themed poems.
Okay. That
are about grief. And her first husband committed suicide. And so it's about that. It's about going through that. She comes out on the other side. And it's interesting, because when I was reading it, I thought, oh God, this is going to be hard. And it's obviously, it's not there's no chuckles in there, but I came to the end of the book, and I felt strangely hopeful, because a lot of the poems are about nature, and she doesn't look away. I mean, the poems are very frank, but her spirit is very gentle. And I came to the end thinking, we will all be okay.
That one feels like it fits in perfectly with those books that you were struggling between. Those 4 books we were talking about. The slow, ruminative.
Yeah, I go dark. But not dark like horror. I really read that. Yeah.
It's not dark though. I mean, it's sad.
Right.
But it is also, you do close. I closed Remains the Day and just felt like, gosh, humans are just such foolish, fragile creatures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which is not necessarily a sad thought in my mind. It's a kind of funny thought. Like, we're just, we take ourselves so seriously, and we're so ridiculous.
Yeah. And the end of the novel is in a strange way, it's kind of hopeful. He's really just come to terms with, oh gosh, my whole life has not been what I thought it was. Mm-hmm. And and he has missed this wonderful opportunity at a different life that he could have had. Mm-hmm. And yet he ends up, it's like, well, okay, it's not over. And the remains of the day, of course, everything is metaphorical. So he's getting to the end of the day, but the sun hasn't set yet. And there's a sense of hope at the end too. And I think part of that hope is just like, oh, you wake up. That's hopeful. You see, you face the difficulties in your life, and you wake up to them, and that there's hope there.
Well, I loved it. Thank you so much for choosing this. I so enjoyed rereading it.
Oh,
It was really delightful. And thank you for joining me. Can you tell our listeners where they can find you and your books online?
Well, I have a website, and if you just Google Debra Dean, it's there. I'm technically on Facebook, but I have gone off of social media. So I'm there. If somebody messages me, I will get the message and I'll respond. But I'm not posting a lot. And yeah, my books are wherever, Amazon, wherever. Oh yeah, let's talk about where they are.
Yeah, let's talk about where your books are.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the start. I am not ordering my books on Amazon, as tempting as it is, because I'm ordering them through independent booksellers because they really need our love now. And they, West Coasters could, if you have an affection for Powell's, as I did when I lived on the West Coast, that's a good place to get your books. But I live in Miami, and so my bookstore of choice is Books and Books, and people can order from them online, and it's you get to be, they'll deliver, they'll do all the things that Amazon does, but you get to feel good about it because you're saving you're saving part of the culture.
And we will put a link to Books and Books in the show notes so that our listeners can go there and show them some love.
Yeah. The other thing about Books and Books is you can pick up the phone and you can call and talk to a bookseller if you don't know what to read next. Because I don't know about you, but I get sometimes it's like, we were talking about this, I miss going into a bookstore and not knowing what I'm going in for. And they are really great at saying, oh, you read this? What do you like? Oh, here's what you should read, So you can do that on the phone with them.
Oh my God. I never thought of doing that.
Yeah, you can't do that on Amazon.
No. So then I browse on Amazon, but I also know that I'm being marketed to based on previous purchases. And it never occurred to me to call a bookstore and just say, here's what I like. What should I buy?
What should I read next? Yeah.
Oh, that is such a good idea. I'm going to do that. Debra, thank you. This has been absolutely delightful.
It has been. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening, bookworms. For more information on this episode and links to everything we discussed, please go to our website, bestbookeverpodcast.com, or follow us on Instagram at bestbookeverpodcast. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and you can find me everywhere as Julie Wrote a Book. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on whatever podcatcher you use. Reviews really help our visibility to new listeners, and we are so grateful for everyone. If you want access to exclusive content, including extra interview time with our guests, advance notice of the books we're going to discuss, monthly curated book selections, and more, go to patreon.com/bestbookever. That's patreon.com/bestbookever to support us. Your financial support really helps with the expenses of running this podcast. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you at the library.